Hi, thanks Llewellyn, welcome. Today I'm talking about the life of Gruffudd ap Cynan, which is an important manuscript about the life of Gruffudd ap Cynan, who lived in the 11th and 12th centuries. It was in Latin and it's been an important part of Wales for some time in Welsh and English. And this is based today on a book translated and edited by Paul Russell. If you can read that, I'll put his name here and the name here. Yep. One thing I need to mention is the genealogy aspect. I've taken a piece out of Gruffudd ap Cynan because it's literally a list of Gruffudd was the son of Cynan, son of Arthur, son of Gugan, son of Belimawr, son of Brutus, and it goes on for pages about this, but you need to know how important it was for the medieval Welsh, that they took their pedigree and race very seriously. So I don't want to just leave that out without letting you know how important that was. And I'll note that in the video, the part that I've taken out, by this, you'll hear this sound. Yep. Okay, and so I'm going to leave you alone and let you enjoy the video, but first I just need to note a couple things. I've changed a couple of the place names from English to Welsh. So Chester is called Caer, Henffordd is in English Hereford, and Shrewsbury is Amwythig. And that's pretty much the most of it. Oh, there's a Cantrev, and the plural Cantrevi is a Welsh administrative unit, meaning kind of, it's similar to a parish, but just think of it sort of like that. 100 towns it literally means, but even though it's not really 100 towns. So yeah, enjoy the video, and if you want to like, subscribe. I'm not going to bother you again on this video, so enjoy. When Edward the Confessor was ruling in England, and King Tordelbach was ruling over the Irish, there was born in Ireland in the city of Dublin, Gruffudd, King of Gwynedd, and he was fostered in a place in the Cummote of Sord Colwyn Chile, which lies 30 miles away from the home of his parents. His father, Cynan, was King of Gwynedd, his mother, Ragnell, daughter of Olaf, King of the city of Dublin and of a fifth part of Ireland. From how noble and regal a lineage Gruffudd stemmed, both on the paternal and maternal side. The corresponding genealogies derived from his ancestors in direct line demonstrate. So far we have presented the nobility of his race, and that since it refers to Gruffudd in a human way and according to the reasoning of earthly matters, I hope that I shall be doing something worthwhile if I set out his, as it were, heavenly pedigree and divine lineage, about whom in common with other men that verse of the Psalter testifies, "You are gods, and sons of the Most High are you all." Thus let it be truly affirmed that Gruffudd was the son of Cynan, Cynan the son of Adam, and Adam the son of God. Since it is being considered how fine the nobility of Gruffudd is, both earthly and heavenly, let us take that well-known prophecy of Myrddin, easily the chief of the British poets, who is said to have prophesied about Gruffudd. A fierce attacker is prophesied, who will come from over the sea, intent on onslaught. His name is Despoiler, and he will despoil many. Welshmen most dear to me, whom I embrace with fraternal affection, you see Gruffudd with an earthly nobility of race, most commended by the prophecy of Myrddin, and so it seems we should hasten forward, now that these basic facts have been happily set out, to his famous achievements and magnificent deeds, which in the custom of the ancients we have undertaken to recount, under the guidance not of Diana or Apollo, but of Christ himself the ancient. And so when Gruffudd was already cultivated in his habits, brought up most gently, he was spending the years of his youth in his mother's home, among his relatives. His mother would often recount to him what kind of man his father had been, and how great he had been, how rich his realm, and how famous a kingdom was owed to him, and also how cruel a tyrant now held it. Upset by these words, he would often turn these things over sadly in his mind, and in the end he set out to the court of King Murchav, and set his most serious complaints before him and the other kings of Ireland, showing that a foreign people were ruling over his paternal inheritance, and seeking humbly that they should help him in providing auxiliary forces, by which he might regain it even by force of arms. It was agreed to help him, and each promised to provide help at the appropriate time. Overjoyed at this response, he gave thanks to God and to them. And when the awaited time arrived, he prepared the ships and boarded them, set sail, and ploughed a furrow through the sea to Wales, and put in it a port called Abermenai. In Wales at that time, Treachery, son of Caradog, and Cynwrig, son of Rewallan, king of Powys, were holding power unjustly and deservedly over the whole of Gwynedd, which they had divided between themselves. From this place Gruffudd sent out messengers to the men of Ynys Môn and of Orfon, and to the 3 sons of Merid and Llyn, namely Aser, Merion, and Gwrgan, and to other men that they might come to meet him as quickly as they could. They set aside all delay and came and greeted him and asked why he had come. When he explained to them, he sought more urgently from them that they might help him to regain his paternal inheritance. Certainly it was his right for him to rule over them, and that they should take up arms with him against those who were ruling his territory unjustly, as if newly arrived from other parts. When he had finished this meeting, and the secret council was dispersed, Gruffudd set off by sea again, either to the castle of Rhydlan, to the noble and powerful Baron Robert, or to Hugh, Count of Caer, to beg for help against the enemies ravaging his ancestral possessions. After Robert found out who he was, and why he had come, and what he was asking of him, he amicably promised to help him. Whilst he had been consulting these people, there came to Gruffudd a wise woman called Tangwystil, his kinswoman, and wife of Llywiach ol Buwch, to greet him as a kinsman, and to predict by a certain omen that the kingdom would be his. And so she offered as a gift to him a very fine shirt, the best she had, and which had once belonged to Gruffudd, son of Llywelyn, son of Seisyll, who had once been king. Indeed, Llywiach, her husband, was held in high regard in this castle, and had been in charge of the treasury for Gruffudd ap Llywelyn. From here Gruffudd finally boarded ship and returned to the port of Abermenai. From here he sent armed soldiers, namely the sons of Merid, to the sanctuary at Clunog out of fear of the men of Powys and other powerful men, with chosen whom had chosen from Tegengel, and into the Cantref of Llyn in order to defeat the oppressor Cynwrig. Those men keenly set out and attacked him unexpectedly when he was free from worries and expecting nothing, and killed him and a very large part of his men. At this time Gruffudd had settled camp at Abermenai, awaiting the outcome of the venture and praying for their success, when behold a young man of Orfon called Anyan came running ahead to be the first to deliver the good news, namely that the ravager had fallen, and to claim his reward as a boon, namely a beautiful woman called Dylad, who had previously been the concubine of King Bleddyn, just as once a young Almilechete ran to David from a battle with the Philistines in the mountains of Gilboa, carrying the armband and scepter of King Saul, and David gladly gave him. Now the soldiers who had been sent on the aforesaid mission returned proclaiming victory, and they persuaded Gruffudd that he should move forward from this good omen to recover Ynys Môn, Orfon, Llyn, and those territories on the border with England, that he should accept the submission of his people, and that he should make a circuit of the whole of Gwynedd, owed to him by hereditary right, which God, in his mercy towards him, had now offered him to purge. With this done, he led his large army into the cantref of Merioneth, where Treachery, the other of the usurpers, lived, and a battle was fought in the valley called in Welsh Gwaederw, or Bloody Field to this day. God granted him victory at that time over his enemies, and many on Treachery's side fell. He himself, saved from the battle, scarcely escaped with a few men, and Gruffudd pursued him with his army through deserts and mountains right up to the boundaries of his country. After this battle the name of Gruffudd grew in fame. He was publicly hailed as King of Gwynedd, like a champion running a race, and he was surrounded by great rejoicing, because he had been able to free Gwynedd, which had been oppressed by cruel and pagan lords, just as Judas Maccabeus had freed the land of Israel from the domination of unbelieving kings and from neighbouring tribes by attacking them incessantly. And so when matters were completed in this way, he began to rule the kingdom by right, to bring peace to the people, and to govern everything in the Lord, yet even so with a rod of iron. When some time has elapsed, by the persuasion of the nobles, he regathered his large army and marched toward the castle of Rhydlon to fight with Robert, the warden of the castle, and the other French, who at that time had been brought there from England and were migrating to live within the boundaries of Gwynedd. When the signal was given, and he led his army out from the camp, laid waste, and burnt everything, taking home extremely rich spoils. Many of their armoured and helmeted cavalry fell from their horses, and perished in battle, and many of the infantry too. And barely a few of the Gauls safely retreated to the tower unharmed. After the kings, barons, and Gruffudd's kinsmen in Ireland heard that matters had turned out very well for him, they welcomed his good fortune as one who had been born and reared among them. But the 3 sons of Merwydd and all the men of Cynan rose up against their legitimate ruler, Gruffudd, and in the middle of one night they killed 52 of the Irish cavalry and warband of Gruffudd, who were lodged among them. When news of this discord, which had arisen between Gruffudd and his own people, reached Treachery, he immediately approached the men of Powys, and asked that they gather their soldiers, and set out with him to Gwynedd to avenge the death of Cynurig, their kinsman. From there, Gwrgenai, son of Chelcileus, and a sub-king of Powys, and his warband came with Treachery and his warband to subjugate the kingdom of Gruffudd. When the 3 sons of Merwydd and the men of Cynan and Evionydd heard this, like perjurers, treaty breakers, and helpers of the enemy, they plotted the fall of their master Gruffudd, and became guides for the enemy. 2 brothers from Ynys Mon, namely Tudur and Gollwyn, likewise joined the plot, even though they had received Clonnog Fawr from Gruffudd. When Gruffudd realized their treachery, and that the enemy was coming, he brought with him men from that part of Ynys Mon, facing Orfon, together with many Danes and Irish as he could against the enemy. There was a bloody and fierce battle, and it was fought out very fiercely on both sides. But out of Gruffudd's army many lay killed, and some were captured in battle. Cerid, his foster father, Mac Rhydri, prince of the Irish and lord of Crich Brendan, that is the lofty mountain of St. Brendan the Hermit, and 70 nobles of Ynys Mon fell. Gruffudd, however, was still sitting on his horse among the tightly packed enemy, and looked as if he was harvesting traitors and enemies with his death-dealing sword, just like Agamemnon, the king of Phrygia, once used to fight. Finally, when Tewdwr of Ynys Mon, the chief traitor, drew his sword and seemed to kill Gruffudd from the rear part of his saddle, Gwynci, also a lord of Ynys Mon, carried him from the battle to lead him off to the ships which were in the port of Abermenai, from where they went away to the island of Adran, and from there they crossed to Wexford in Ireland. That unfortunate place where they were defeated is called to this day Bron yr Erw. No one should be surprised at the changes in human fortunes, that sometimes it is necessary to win and sometimes to flee. Indeed, usually the cause is treachery, for in this way the unfaithful people of Israel delivered Judas Maccabeus, their king and leader, into the hands of Demetrius, the king. Judas, however, this warrior of God, like a giant or a lion, avenged himself on both. Julius Caesar, who had subjugated the whole world by continuous warfare, was assassinated by treachery and daggers by the senators of Rome on the Capitolium itself. Even Arthur, the outstanding noble king of the kings of the whole of Britain, worthy of undying fame, waged 12 wars against the Saxons and the Picts. In the first of these, he had been totally routed by treachery in the country of Llwyd Coed, also called Llwyn Llwyd, but in the remaining battles he took worthy vengeance against the Saxons and the Picts, the oppressors of his subjects, and they could not resist him even as an old man. But after Gruffudd had been driven to Ireland, he complained most bitterly about his betrayers and oppressors before the kings and leaders, and they, upset by such a great injustice, tried to persuade him to arrange all the necessary resources and, then restored, to immediately return to his land. Agreeing with their views, with 30 full ships of Irish and Viking soldiers ploughing a furrow across the deep sea, he returned to his native soil, and he seized the port of Abermenai, where he found Treachery ruling. When Treachery heard out of the arrival of the royal fleet, he began to be overcome by sadness, to give out deep sighs, and to waste away in fear and trembling. Those who supported him in Llyn and Ardudwy, he made them move, bringing their wealth with them into the cantref of Meirionnydd, but by their labours he laid low, while Gruffudd transported the remaining part of his army in Llyn and Arfon across from the opposite side to Ynys Môn, so that they might remain secure under his protection. But the companions and his servants became angry that his promises to them had not been fulfilled, and plundered most of Ynys Môn, and attempted to return to their country with their ships laden with spoils, and they took him with them, even though he was unwilling to go. And this betrayal by his own companions was no more easy to bear for the oppressed Gruffudd than that betrayal previously by the Welsh. Then countless evils arose in Gwynedd. To these misfortunes was added the following. A little afterwards, Hugh, Earl of Caer, and other war leaders named the Robert of Rhuddlan, Giern of Amwythig, and Walter of Henforth, collected a very large army of cavalry and infantry, and accomplished also by Gorgenau ap Seisyll and the men of Powys, came through the mountain passes to reach Llyn. They placed their camp in that cantref for a week, and then plundered, routed, and put to flight everything far and wide, and left everywhere full of corpses, to the extent that for the following 8 years that region was regarded as a desert, and the populace, abandoned after such a great disaster, was forced by this misfortune, as if scattered in a foreign land, and most of them served out their harshest slavery elsewhere, and scarcely any of them ever returned to their native land. That was the first disaster inflicted by the Normans, and their first entry into Gwynedd after they arrived in England. When for some years Gruffudd had spent time at the court of King Diarmid and other nobles, he drew up a fleet in the port of Portlarg with the equipment necessary for a voyage, and he sent his fleet, which he had accepted as a gift from the king, laden with Irishmen and Britons, on a very prosperous sea voyage. With favourable winds, he put into the port called Porthclais, not far from the seat of the Archbishop of Tyddewey. Upon his arrival, Rhys ap Tewdwr, king of the southern Welsh, the Bishop of Tyddewey, scholars and the whole choir of Tyddewey, and all the clerics of Tyddewey, set out to the port, and Rhys addressed Gruffudd as follows. Hail, King of the kings of Wales! I take refuge with you. I bend my knee as a suppliant to you, seeking your help and support. And Gruffudd replied, Who are you, and for whose sake have you come? I am the son of Tewdwr, lord of this small realm. now indeed oppressed, in exile and fearful, and I am lying hidden in this holy place." "Who," said Gruffudd, "has forced you to flee here?" "Lord," he said, "3 kings of Wales in particular, who come into this realm with their armies and their companions, drain our resources endlessly. But who," asked Gruffudd, "are these so powerful kings who wander about this kingdom accompanied by such a crowd?" "Caradog, son of Gruffudd, of Upper and Lower Gwent, with his followers, the inhabitants of Morgannwg, together with the Normans, and King Treachery with the people of Arwystli." When he heard the names of the oppressors, seething with anger and rage, Gruffudd asked what reward he would offer for his efforts if he were to attack his enemies. "I shall give you," he said, "half of my kingdom, and I shall offer you homage." Gruffudd accepted the arrangements. Both made for the church sacred to Tyddewey, and prayed for their agreement. When this was confirmed, and a blessing received from the bishop, Gruffudd immediately set off accompanied by Danes, Irish, and other friends to the number of 160, the head of the column led by Cynddelw ap Conws of Ynys Môn. Rhys also with a few southerners joyfully set off at that time, thinking to himself that this was a fine undertaking because he had gained such timely help. After a long journey, nearing evening, they reached the mountains where the above-mentioned kings had placed their camp. Then Rhys said to Gruffudd, "Lord, let us put off the battle until tomorrow, as it is now getting dark." "Put it off," replied Gruffudd, "for as long as you like, but I shall attack with the force I have ready." And he did so, just as he said. The kings were overcome with great terror, and were stunned as they saw the fierce forces of Gruffudd, the dense columns of soldiers, the gleaming standards, the Danes armed with 2-headed axes, and the Irish carrying iron-tipped spears. Gruffudd himself was the first to rush into battle, just like a giant or a lion laying low enemies with every blow of his sword, furiously calling forward his soldiers against the enemy and urging them not to turn their backs to the enemy. It was a savage and fierce battle in which not even a son spared his father. The shouting of the soldiers rose to the heavens, the earth seemed to resound with the thunder of horses and infantry. Violent cries were heard far and wide, and the crashing of weapons was terrible to hear. So great a slaughter occurred, while the army of Gruffudd was defeating his enemy. The rivers of sweat and blood were thought to have flowed down. In the end, Treachery was pierced through, spilling his entrails, lying face down on the ground, and seemed as if disarmed he were eating the grass with his living teeth. Carki, the Irishman, had preserved his body in salt like pork being turned into bacon. In this place there fell of his household 25 horsemen, as if accompanying him, and others in the front rank. Many thousands in addition were killed, and of the remainder some turned and plunged into headlong flight. Gruffudd, as was his usual habit in victory, pursued them through forests, valleys, marshes and mountains, throughout the night by the light of the moon, so that out of such a great number scarcely one returned to his own country. After this terrible battle so bravely fought by Gruffudd, Rhys withdrew himself from the protection and company of one so illustrious, and was afterwards not seen by him. Gruffudd, upset by his treachery, decided to ravage his land, and that is also what happened. The mountains where this battle was fought are called by the locals the Mountains of Carn, because a huge pile of stones was heaped up there under which they believed that treasure had once been buried. After he had completely devastated this region with the greatest plundering and ravaging, he led his forces into the territory of Arwystli, where, raging with slaughter and fire, he dragged their wives and daughters off into captivity, and then avenged the wrongs done by Treachery with their lives. Finally he himself went off into Powys, where he employed the greatest cruelty against his enemies, to the extent that he did not even spare the churches, and so with all his enemies finally routed, and their lands reduced totally to desert, he was received with honour into his paternal inheritance and began to rule, and Gruffudd enjoyed the greatest tranquillity for some time. While Gruffudd was enjoying the delights of his kingdom in this way, the Baron Marion Goch, though bound by loyalty towards him, not only brought a malicious accusation against him for Hugh, Earl of Caer, but also betrayed him in the following way. He persuaded the two earls, the aforementioned Hugh and Hugh of Amwythig, son of Roger, of Baldwin's castle, to bring cavalry and infantry with them in great numbers to the place called Arrig in the Dernion. Then the traitor deceived him, and with these flattering words: "Two noble earls greet you, magnificent prince, who live as your neighbours on the borders of your kingdom. In short, they beg you to think it right to come to speak with them at Arrig in the Dernion, with the guarantee of safe passage in both directions." Gruffudd, putting his trust in these words, set out for that place in his kingdom, and when he came into view of the earls, they ordered that he be arrested, and they held him bound in iron chains in a foul public prison in Caer for 12 years. As for his servants who were captured with him, they were sent away free after being treated inhumanely, in that they had the thumbs of their right hands chopped off. When others heard of this great deed, they scattered in various directions, just like the divine oracle had it said, "I shall strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock shall be scattered." Contemporaries of Gruffudd reported that he was a man of moderate stature, with fair hair, a clever head, a round face, of good colour, eyes properly born, fine eyebrows and a good beard, a round neck, fair skin, strong limbs, long fingers, straight legs and comely feet. He was very polished in his education and outstanding at foreign languages. Towards his soldiers he was kind and generous, towards his enemies spirited and very brave in battle. Meanwhile, Hugh, Earl of Caer, did not delay in leading forces into his lands, and had castles and other garrisons built in various places in the French custom, so that he might control that land. At this time he established a castle on Ynys another in Arvon, in the ancient city of the Emperor Constantine, son of Constantine the Great, and another at Bangor, and another in Merioneth, to which he placed in them cavalry, infantry, and archers, and he employed such cruelty as no age had ever seen. But the cries of the peoples rose to God, and to them he, at an appropriate time, brought help. Then, after a period of 16 years, Gruffudd was freed from prison, and it came about in the following way. A certain young man of Adernion called Cynurig here came to Caer with a small group of companions to buy supplies, and by chance he caught sight of his king in chains in the palace of the city, and he grabbed him in his arms and secretly smuggled him from the city, and by night he attempted the journey to his own country, whilst the citizens were having dinner, and then for some days tended to him at home without telling anyone. After a few days had elapsed, and he had recovered his strength, he took Gruffudd to Ynys secretly by night, where Sandev, a Baire, looked after him in hiding. Not long after, he boarded a ship and attempted to cross over to Ireland, but a contrary wind forced him into the port of Hothney, in the south. From there, travelling on foot accompanied by 9 of his closest companions, one of which perished there, he fought with the military garrisons of that area 3 times, in one and the same day, and 3 times he defeated them. And when there were only those 8 companions left, he himself killed one of the enemy of the high, noble birth, and thus he escaped from their hands. He continued on his journey as far as Ardidwy, though uncertain as to where he might go, lest a Frenchman might betray him. Finally, the sons of Corllwyn, Eginir, Gellan, Merwyd, and Udnaved took him in and supported him in deserted hiding places with the necessary supplies. After some days and months, 60 men joined him, and he travelled through various parts of Gwynedd, like a runaway slave, inflicting serious losses as long as Earl Hugh lived, just like David, son of Jesse of Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, in the time of King Saul. But when the French, who were staying within their castles, realized that he was plotting great misfortune, the soldiers themselves left to defend the land sought, and pursued him keenly through the woods and fields like hunting dogs pursuing a stag. And so, giving up all hope of evading them, he boarded a ship belonging to the Canons of Aberdaron, in which, after a huge effort of rowing, he finally reached Ireland. From there, within a month, he returned in the same ship and found a landing at the river from which he had set sail. From thereafter, adopting a more thoughtful plan, he sailed to the islands of Denmark to his friend King Godfrey, to get from him ships and other things necessary for his affairs. In his youth, he had taken a large refuge with him, and he was confident that he would get support. The king, saddened by his arrival and beginning to sympathize and condole with his many sufferings. Finally, Gruffudd came to Ynys with a fleet of 60 ships, so that he himself and those who would come with him from the islands might wage war against the French garrisoning the castles. But the inhabitants proved a very great obstacle for him. A battle was fought savage and cruel from dawn till dusk, and many fell on both sides, and especially in the first clash, those who were outstanding in bravery. Then Gruffudd rushed forward into the most densely packed part of the enemy and placed himself in the front line, so that he might lay low the French in their armour, their helmets, and armed with two-headed axes, like King David among the Philistines. Night halted the battle, and the ships set off for the islands, but he himself took himself off separately, in only one ship to the island of Dinewid, from where he plundered a ship sailing from the port of Caer and killed the sailors. And on the next day, sailing for Cynan, he safely entered the port of Nevin with all his men. When the news of this reached the inhabitants of the Cantrevy, they immediately rushed to him from every part of the kingdom. The men of Llyn, Efionydd, Ardudwy, Arfon, Ross, and Dyffryn Clwyd, who were held bound by their loyalty to their lord. Gruffudd, strengthened by this great army which had gathered in his way, with God, the best and greatest, supporting him, he led his forces against the castle, which we said above had been built in Ynys and took it by storm over a period of some days. But the French under siege hurled spears and fired arrows and threw down stones from the walls, strongholds and towers, and defended themselves in all other ways, until finally they were forced by the continuous daily contest of the siege of the Welsh to yield, and their leader fell, the seneschal, who was in charge of the castle, and another 64 with him. After this castle had been burnt down and the enemy taken by storm, overjoyed by such success, Gruffudd went against the remaining castles in his realm, and by warfare he captured them, destroyed them, and burnt them down, and slew all the people in them. In this way, with all his enemies cast into chains, he rendered Gwynedd free of castles, and acquired his paternal inheritance, and for 2 years Gwynedd enjoyed peace and tranquility. And it should not be passed over that Gruffudd had fought at Aberllenog in Ynys with 60 soldiers and 14 strong youths sent off to burn and plunder, and he had killed many of the people in the castle and completely laid waste to everything. He went off to the other side of Ynys where 3 of his ships were standing at anchor, and suddenly the other men of the castle, together with the men of Ynys attacked him, and pursued him for the whole day, and kept provoking his rearguard into battle. Nevertheless, as before, Gruffudd undertook the journey he had begun, carried off plunder, and brought with him French and Saxon captives in chains, and killed as many as he could of the ambushes in prolonged battle. In this battle for Gerllan, the harpist, the pencerdd, near the ships on Gruffudd's side. With what variety of knowledge, with what splendor of eloquence should he have been, he who could narrate the famous deeds of Gruffudd and his achievements in Wales, Ireland, and the Sussex Isles of Denmark, and among various other peoples. I freely admit that I do not have that ability, nor indeed would I be equal to such a great task, even if I had the power of the eloquence of Tullius in oratory, or I could defeat Homer in verse. While Gruffudd was being tossed about by the variable waves of fate, sometimes favourable, sometimes unfavourable, he took as his wife Angharad, daughter of Owain ab Edwin, the wise men of his realm used to report that she was wise, noble, modest, fair-haired, with eyes and a hawk-like body. Each single part of her body suited her as fittingly as possible: straight legs, elegant feet, long fingers, very slender nails. They said furthermore that she was genial and elegant of speech, in habit and gesture how decorous, sensible, and cautious. Sensible in advice, kind to friends, generous to the poor, and most well informed in all important matters. He had 8 children by her, 3 sons, Cadwallon, Owain, and Cadwaladr, and 5 daughters, Gwenllian, Margaret, Ranallt, Susanna, and Honest. He also had some children by concubines. But when William of the Long Sword, King of England, received news of the hostile expeditions and the bravery and savagery of Gruffudd against the French, he found it intolerable, and he roused the strength of his whole kingdom against him, and led into Gwynedd various squadrons of cavalry and infantry, with which he planned to destroy and exterminate the natives, so that he might not leave even a dog pissing against a wall. He also embarked upon a scheme of cutting down and destroying the forests and groves, so that not even, as it were, a shadow might be left by which the weaker might protect themselves. First of all, he placed his tents and camps within castles surrounded by walls. Some Welshmen were his leaders and guides. When Gruffudd heard of this great preparation for war, he gathered the forces of the whole realm to go and meet him, and he placed ambushes in the narrow passes on the roads, so that as the army was coming down out of the mountains, it would suddenly fall into them. Fitting such tactics, the Englishmen returned to Caer through the centre of the land, and from this expedition of his neither did the natives suffer any damage with which he had threatened them, nor did the treacherous guides gain the rewards of their labours for which they had hoped, except that each might by chance be presented with a single cow. But the Englishman lost a very large part of his army, and wagons and servants, and a very large number of horses. In this way the presumption of the French collapsed and came to nothing. The forces of Gruffudd, accustomed to sometimes to engage them from the front, sometimes to pursue them from the rear, sometimes from the right, sometimes from the left, so that they should not do damage to his subjects. And if Gruffudd had sent his men against them, as they were crossing through the pathless forests, the Englishmen and the French would have seen their final day. But he restrained the ferocity of his men, just as once David behaved towards Saul. Whilst matters were proceeding unsuccessfully in this way, the above-mentioned Hugh, Earl of Caer, architect of all misfortunes, like Antiochus of old, since he held a deep sense of grievance at the murder of his own garrisons, with his castles totally destroyed and cavalry slaughtered, prepared a heavily laden fleet, and now would be avenging himself at once upon the Welsh. In this venture he had another Hugh, Earl of Amwythig, with his own army, so that setting out at the same time they might avenge those many injuries perpetrated by Gruffudd and the countless losses caused by him. And so finally they led their troops into the lands of Gruffudd, with Owain ab Edwin and his brother Eochtrid, and their followers ahead of them. When the situation became known, it roused the natives of Gwynedd and Powys as if from deep sleep, so that they might resist them more bravely, casting aside even the appearance of obedience. Because of this, the princes of Powys, namely Cadogan and Meredydd, his brother, brought out all their people into the land of Gruffudd, and after taking proper counsel together, they both withdrew to Ynys Môn, where, as if in a very strong city surrounded on all sides by the steepest sea, they settled themselves, and this principally because 16 long ships were being sent from Ireland to help Gruffudd, with which they might fight against the fleet of the Earls in naval battle. When the Earls discovered this, they secretly sent messengers to the commanders of the fleet, promising them very great rewards and asking them to fail Gruffudd when he was in the greatest danger and in dire straits, and to leave him deprived of all support. And this is what they did. Indeed, deceived by the trickery of the French, and with their promise to Gruffudd broken, they handed the whole island over to the enemy, empty of guards to be plundered. Gruffudd was cast into the deepest agony of indecision by the deception of the French, uncertain in his plans as to whether he should act against the force of the French or the defection of the fleet. And so after he had thought the matter over with his people, he seized a small boat, and with Cadogan at Blethen, he sailed across to Ireland, commending his people and his property to the goodwill and protection of God, who promised to help all whenever they are oppressed by troubles. But the people, to be pitied in so many ways, when they realized that he had gone, sought safety for themselves in flight and went off to lie hidden and to conceal themselves in underground caves, marshes, forest groves, uncultivated fields, water tanks, bogs, ruins, cliffs, and other places, through fear of the French and other foreigners who were driving them to destruction. It was not difficult for the earls and their army to wander the length and breadth of the whole island on that same day, to slaughter people, to plunder the property of some, to chop the limbs off others, until night brought a halt to their pursuit. But behold, on the next day, unexpectedly, by the singular providence of God, an approaching royal fleet came into view, and when it was spotted by the French, indeed now it would have overcome the treaty-breaking Danes who had deceived Gruffudd, they turned to their well-practiced arts of deception, and they sent to the islanders some of the Welshmen who were in league with them, to urge them to make a pact, and to persuade them immediately to establish a peace on whatever terms they could best achieve, for they were afraid they might be pressured on two fronts at the same time, namely, lest at the same time they would be forced to fight with the Welsh fugitives on one side, and with this royal fleet on the other. In this way the deceitful French ensnared in their deceit the wretched people of this island, oppressed by the heaviest slavery, into treachery, with hope that so that subsequent generations might not remember such a disaster. However, the singular spirit of a divine mind thought it right to steer that fleet, which we have said had been unexpectedly spotted, and which belonged to the King of Cynan, to Ynys in order at last to free his people beset by misfortunes. Indeed, they called upon their Lord out of their unending burdens and anxieties, and God made them safe. When the king in command of his fleet was told through guides what island this was, who was its king, how great the slaughter was happening there, how terrible was the persecution, and who the perpetrators of such a cruel massacre were, he began to share that grief and become angry, and so he sent 3 ships to go to the shore. When the French saw this, though more fearful than little women, in full armour and, as was their custom, mounted on horseback, they went into battle with the king and those who had landed from the ships. But the king and his sailors fought bravely against them. The French fell from their horses like figs from a tree, some dead and others wounded by the unceasing blows of the Danes. But the king launched an arrow from the prow of his ship, and it struck Hugh, Earl of Amwythig, in the eye, and he was laid low on the ground lifeless, though he was in full armour, and for a while struggled with the weapon. The French were put to flight by this chance occurrence, and showed their backs to the Danes. The king, however, immediately withdrew his fleet, because he had undertaken this journey, with a huge band of soldiers, to look at the islands of Britain and Ireland, which were regarded as the furthest of the whole world. But Earl Hugh and the other Frenchmen, overcome with joy, took their plunder, which they had gathered together, with them into the safer places of the Captivity of Ynys, through fear of Gruffudd, whom they were expecting at any moment. There they also divided the corn and cattle of the inhabitants, half of which they took with them to Caer. Then the Danes appeared, those lying traitors who had deceived Gruffudd because Hugh had lavishly promised them a very generous share of the men, women, slaves, and girls, a fine reward for treachery. He then paid them like a faithful man to the unfaithful, as the divine word confirmed. For after he had gathered from every part all the toothless hags, the humped-backed, the lame, one-eyed, fat and weak, he offered them to the Danes in payment for their treachery. When they saw this wretched band of prisoners, they raised anchor and took to the open sea and made for Ireland. And he who was ruler at that time punished them severely, some with death, others with chopping off limbs, and driving others from every part of his kingdom into perpetual exile as a punishment. And behold, Gruffudd at the same time, following his old custom, returned from Ireland and found his country completely reduced to a desert, and his subjects carried off elsewhere. And so he sent ambassadors to Earl Hugh, and by their efforts it came about that conditions of peace were concluded between them. As a result, 3 villes in that country were conceded to him. From this time on, for several years, Gruffudd led a humble life spent in various cares, consoling himself with hope of better things and divine providence. After some years had gone by, he travelled to the court of Henry, King of England, who had succeeded his brother, and with the intervention of the Bishop of Bangor, he gained from him a living favour, friendship, with recognition of his many possessions. The king even granted him in peace and goodwill the contrefi of Llyn, Efionydd, Ardudwy, and Llechwedd, along with their inhabitants and possessions. When Gruffudd returned to his land from the king's court, he entered into the possession of these lands, thanking God, who disposes the powerful from their strongholds and raises the humble, who makes one person a debtor and another a creditor, who humbles a man and then raises that same man to high honour. Then everything developed favourably for Gruffudd, because he had held his hopes fixed upon God. Other people daily drifted to him from Hross with their possessions, without waiting for or asking for the permission of the Earl Hugh, and thus he began to increase the number of his people. In the following year, he himself with his men set out for Ynys Môn, and there he lived and ruled, and from there he travelled to the other commodes. In this way, he regained his previous power and standing in Gwynedd, just like Maccabeus, son of Mattathias, once in Israel. He also freed from the heavy yoke of slavery his subjects who had been oppressed on account of the interminable necessities of war, and he filled the whole of Gwynedd with rejoicing, like the Israelites returning from captivity in Babylon. But the Earl was angry that Gruffudd against his will had seized or conquered his own hereditary territories. Moreover, the King of England was surprised at this deed of his, and so he dug into his treasury and paid massive sums to the King of Scotland, the Scots, and the southern Welsh. He led these forces into the kingdom of Gruffudd and placed his camps within walled castles. But Gruffudd himself, having very frequent experience of the demands of war, set his camp opposite him, on the arms, as it were, of snowy Eryri. From their positions, ambassadors were sent regularly from both sides, and finally, after a truce, there was an agreement on a form of peace. Thus Henry returned to England, and Gruffudd returned to his own realm. But after a short period of time, Henry returned with a fine army, and placed his camp in the same place as before, namely in the very mountains themselves, so that he might at last root out the realm of Gruffudd and destroy his subjects at sword point, as it were, slaughter them, and completely wipe them out. But Gruffudd gathered his people and, as was his custom, directed them to meet Henry, after sending his valuables with his wives and children across into the deserted areas of the mountains of Rhywyddfa, where they would be out of any fear of danger. It turned out, however, that the king, fearing that he might fall into the hands of Gruffudd as he descended out of the mountain tops into the valleys, made peace and withdrew to England. Kind God, how many times the earls tried to overturn Gruffudd and could not. How many times the inhabitants of Powys made an attempt upon him and could not. How many times the accomplices of the traitor Treachery attacked him and could not. After enduring such great labours, Gruffudd ruled for many years, affluent with wealth and rejoicing in a calm and unbroken peace, and was on the friendliest terms and greatest concord with neighbouring kings, namely Henry, King of England, Machad, King of Ireland, and the kings who ruled the islands of Denmark, and his name was famous not only in the adjacent kingdoms, but even in the furthest lands. Now throughout Gwynedd all kinds of good things began to increase. Now the people began to found churches, sow acorns, plant trees, and build orchards and gardens, and surround themselves with pools, ditches, and fences, to construct buildings, and to gather for use the produce and fruits in the manner of the Romans. Gruffudd also built large churches next to his palaces, which he built and established beautifully, sparing no expense. What then was the result? Gwynedd sparkled with churches and dedications like the heaven with stars. He governed his people with an iron rod, but also encouraged peace and concord with kingdoms neighbouring him, and he placed his sons, while still young, in charge of the most distant country in his kingdom, so that they might be, as it were, peace with foreign peoples, as opposition to those who might wish to rise up against him. Minor kings would often make for his court, sometimes to seek help, sometimes for consolation and counsel, whenever foreigners were causing them trouble. In the end, now worn down by old age and having lost the sight of his eyes, he gave himself over to tasks of mercy, thinking to himself what perpetual memorial he might leave of his military achievements, and he withdrew to a more remote place, to give himself time for more intense contemplation of divine matters, and to lead a more godly life, completely despising worldly powers. And when he realized that the end of his life was near, he ordered his children to be summoned, so that he might set out for them what he wished to happen and to be carried out, just as the king Ezekias once did. And so he divided his possessions, the justice of which will remain forever. To the Church of Christ in Dublin, where he was born and fostered, he gave 20 pieces of silver, and to each cathedral church of Ireland, and the Church of Tyddewey, the monasteries of Caer and of Amwythig, the same amount. Even more did he bequeath to the Church of Bangor, and to the Church of Caergybi. He gave 10 pieces of silver, and the same amount to Penmon, Llanarmon, Dinerth, Clonog, and Lly and Mavod, and to many other major churches. These he granted to the bishops, archdeacons, priests, clerics, doctors, and needy Christians, so that they might be defended by the protection of the Holy Spirit, who sees and knows all things. And as now he was reaching the end and waiting for the end of his life, there came to him from the whole of his realm famous and wise men, namely David, Bishop of Bangor, Simeon, the archdeacon, the prior of the monastery of Caer, a man outstanding in learning and wisdom, and many other priests and scholars, so that they might anoint his body with consecrated oil, according to the precept of the Apostle James. His sons were with him, and he blessed them, and predicted what would eventually happen to them, like the patriarch Jacob, who blessed his sons in Egypt. And he gave them instructions to conduct themselves bravely, and to resist their enemies fiercely, as he had done in his later years. The Queen Ingharad, his wife, was also present at the same time, and he bequeathed her half of his possessions, and 2 portions of land together with the harbour dues of Abramelai. His daughters were present, and some of their sons, and to each he assigned shares, so that they might live more comfortably after his death. Welshmen, Irishmen, and Danes lamented the death of Gruffudd, just like the Jews once mourned Joshua son of Nun. Gruffudd was 82 years old when he departed this life. He was buried in the church at Bangor, with a gleaming monument erected to the left of the high altar. Let us pray that his soul may rest in peace in the Lord, with the souls of other famous kings. Amen.